Hello again, everyone. Good evening. My name is Shanaz Azar. I just gave my married name. Sorry, I'm obviously on automatic pilot. My name is Shanaz Sutawala, and this is my colleague Sarah Chang. For those of you who don't
My
know.
Wix site is fast.
Oh. Thank you for coming to this opening event for Open. Thanks for making the time, and we hope that you have also perhaps now, with this game that we had as our introductory piece, which is called Making Space, that you've also made some space in your day from your practice and from the London noise and humdrum. Open is a research initiative that has come out of decolonial thinking and practice that we have been doing in history of design. For more than a year now, Sarah Chang and I have been collaborating on ideas about decolonial practice and pedagogy, and we've also been joining forces with Dr. Livia Resende, who used to be with us in the HOD team. In fact, it is Livia who conceived of and designed our opening game and suggested the playing of the beautiful music that you just heard. So big shout out to Livia, who now lives in Sydney with her new job. And thank you also to Katie Dean, who is hiding somewhere at the back, I think, who has been with us. She is History of Design alumna, and she's been helping us as our research and project assistant for tonight's event. Tonight, our event is called Emotional Positions. We have a number of games organised to think about how we translate our worldviews and experiences, how we express our cultural differences. We are particularly interested in exploring through these games ideas of self-care, respect, and positionality, to think about how these relate to our practice and to our teaching. Open is open to play, creativity, reflection, and questioning, and we hope that this will resonate with you tonight. This is the first in a series of events and exhibitions that will unfurl through the year. We will keep you posted on what's next. But to kick us off today, I'm delighted to welcome our very special guest speaker, Elif Shafak. Thank you, Elif, so much for being here with us. Elif is an award-winning British-Turkish novelist. She is the most widely read female author in Turkey. She writes both in English and in Turkish and has published 17 books, 11 of which are novels, including the best-selling The Bastard of Istanbul, The 40 Rules of Love, and 3 Daughters of Eve. Her work has been translated into 50 languages. In 2017, she was chosen by Politico as one of the 12 people who would make the world a better place. And Elif's books are on sale outside this evening. Elif is also a political scientist and an academic with a background in both international relations and gender and women's studies. And she has a PhD in political science and political philosophy. She has taught at various universities in Turkey, the UK, and the USA, and she is an honorary fellow at Oxford. Elif is incredibly prolific across many media. She has judged numerous literary prizes, and this year I think is chairing the Wellcome Book Prize. We welcome her today to share with us her amazing insights around emotions and storytelling, and to reflect with us how emotional positions can help us think about our contemporary moment, and of course to hear her reflections on how to make the world a better place. So welcome, Elif.
Thank you so much for the very warm, very generous introduction. Can you hear me well? Do you think I have to lean forward a little bit, or especially that, is it fine? I'm very much looking forward to our event, and I say our event because I sincerely am looking forward also to your questions If you don't agree with anything I say, please feel free to share it with me, your remarks, so that we can turn this into a dialogue. That's why I want to keep my own talk shorter and have more time for Q&A session. But I thought I could start by telling you a little bit about myself, my journey, and the word journey is very important for me. I do believe that life itself is a journey, and we change a lot. To me, that metaphor, thinking of life, thinking of identity, thinking of ourselves in fluid terms, as water, is very important, and it's one of the themes that I want to come back. But very briefly, I was born in France, in Strasbourg. That was the first country that I have known. But after a while, my parents' marriage collapsed, and my father stayed in France. With my mom, we came to Turkey, to Ankara. And this was a very conservative, very patriarchal neighborhood in Ankara. It was my grandmother's world. And at the time, my mom was a very young divorcee. She had no diploma, no money, because she had dropped out of university in order to get married. And she had no career to fall back, to pursue. So women in such positions in very patriarchal settings, they immediately married off to someone else. But it was my grandmother, who was much more Eastern, if I may put it in those words, who intervened and who said, no, my daughter should go back to university. She should have a career, she should have a diploma, she should have choices in life. And in the meantime, I'm going to take care of my granddaughter. As a result of which, I was raised by my grandmother until the age I was 10 years old. And I used to call her anne, which in Turkish means mother. And my own mother I used to call abla, which in Turkish means big sister. So it was a little bit confusing. And it was a bit unusual. So I think in many ways I felt like an outsider in that community, a bit like an insider-outsider. And that feeling perhaps has never left me. After a while, my mother, she graduated with flying colors. She became a diplomat. By the time I was 11 years old, 10, 11, she and I started traveling together. So from that very conservative neighborhood, I found myself in Madrid, in Spain, in a very international school where I was the only Turk, the only Turkish student. And in a way, maybe at an early age, I had to think about what it means to have a collective identity. Are we ourselves as individuals, or do we represent something larger than ourselves? And this was a time when you're very young, but you might have heard about it. A Turkish terrorist had tried to kill the Pope. This was a time when there had been a coup d'etat in Turkey, and there were severe human rights violations. It was a time when Turkey in Eurovision Song Contest got 0 points. So I would go to school, and I remember each of those moments because I would go to school, and the children would be making fun of me, and I had to think about that. What does it mean to have a national identity, a national belonging? Am I myself? But fast forward, I think over the years I've lived in very different cities, very different countries, and maybe I started to see literature, particularly the art of storytelling, as my only suitcase, as the only thing that kept my pieces together and that gave me a sense of continuity in life. And I know it sounds like a cliche, but to me it is truth. Books were my best friends since an early age onwards, because I was a very lonely child. I was a solitary child, and books opened up a different world to me. So I always thought my life was very boring, but Storyland to me was much more real, much more convincing than so-called real life. And maybe I also need to share with you that the period that I'm talking about is a period of extreme political violence in Turkey. So I remember as a child sitting by the window in my grandmother's house. Inside her house, it was full of superstitions, spirituality, evil eye beads, melting lead. It was a world of magic, quite irrational in many ways. She was a healer in her own way. So there was that irrational world inside the house, full of oral stories, full of oral culture. And outside the house, outside the window, there would be bombs exploding, people, the radical left and radical right fighting. and always this sense of uncertainty and danger in the wind. And I remember maybe thinking about these two worlds at the same time. Maybe that left an impact on me, because when I look at my work today, there's a desire to perhaps weave more spiritual, more magical elements with the more political, with the more realistic analysis. So I always wanted to be aware of both worlds, the world inside the house and the world outside. When I look at my novels, I realize each and every one of them is different. And that's because books changed me. I believe they changed their readers, but they also changed their writers. We're a different person by the time we finish. And I think that's because the art of storytelling compels us to just leave our space for a moment and just be someone else, and then someone else. I love that shifting angles. To me, that taught a lot, mentally, maybe intellectually, spiritually. I remember very clearly when I was a high school student, for the first time, I was reading a novel by Ivo Andrić, and this is a novel called The Bridge Over the Drina. And by then, of course, I had gone to school abroad, but I had gone to school in Turkey as well. And overall, I had internalized a very nationalistic official history, written from only one perspective, top down. But here was Ivo Andrić, a writer, a storyteller, telling me the story of the Balkans under the Ottoman Empire from a perspective that had never, ever occurred to me as a Turkish citizen. In the book, in one chapter, there are two Balkan peasants, and they're talking about the Janissary system. One of them is saying very positive things about it, one of them is saying very negative things about it. You might be familiar with that system. The Janissaries were the military force in the Ottoman Empire. Lots of particularly Christian children were taken from their families. They joined the army. They were converted to Islam. Many of them came from poor backgrounds, and some of them became viziers. So it's a very complex system. Therefore, one of the peasants is saying, well, thanks to this system, our poor kids were able to make it to the top, become rich and wealthy and powerful. And the other one is saying, well, but at the expense of what? Their identities were erased. They could never see their families again. They could never see their mothers again. The reason why I'm sharing this with you is because if it weren't for that story, it would have never occurred to me to think of the Ottoman Empire through the eyes of peasants living in the Balkans, because the history that I had learned was devoid of human beings. And then when you start asking questions, okay, how did people live? Who are the people? How can I tell the story, understand the story through the eyes of individuals? What did that system mean for an Armenian silversmith, or a Jewish miller, or a concubine in the harem, or a prostitute who was accompanying the army? When you just narrow it down to individual stories, you realize that the truth can change enormously depending on who is telling the story. And the problem is, of course, not many people have had the right to tell the story. So the stories that we know today have always been filtered. And this to me is very important, because in all my novels, even though each and every one of them are very different, I think there's an undercurrent, there's a desire to bring the periphery to the center, to give more voice to people who have been more voiceless, to give more voice to minorities. And when I say minorities, this could be sexual minorities, cultural, ethnic minorities, or anyone who has felt like the other in a given context. I'm always interested in that person's story. And to me, this is one of the main functions of the art of storytelling. I don't like it when writers try to preach. I don't like it when writers try to teach something as if they're above their readers or above the text. We are not. But I think a writer's job is to ask questions, difficult questions about difficult issues, just to say, why is it like that? Can we talk about this? And create an open space where we can have a diversity of voices. So to me, of course, stories are very important. They're my passion, but I'm equally interested in silences. the things we cannot talk about, political, sexual, cultural taboos. And that too is very central to my work. And if I may add this, I think especially the world we're living in, and I would love to talk about this with you, unfortunately we're being pulled into tribes, right? Tribal identities. And there are lots of extremist ideologies that are telling us just to be one thing, because all extremist ideologies are anti-pluralistic, no matter what. They can't deal with complexity, so they want to narrow us down to just one single color, one single identity. That's what they have in common. And the second thing they have in common is they always dehumanize the other. They make the other inferior in their narrative. And I think a writer's job, a novelist's job, is to rehumanize those who have been dehumanized by telling people's stories. Because when we know someone's stories, it is much harder for us to think of them as numbers. And perhaps one final thing I want to add is, as Shehnaz so generously mentioned, I have a background in political science, and there was a time when I very extensively read the works of Frankfurt School thinkers like Walter Benjamin, Adorno, Horkheimer. They left a big impact on me, Hannah Arendt afterwards. But what I found the most striking, I think, was all these people who have gone through lots of calamities in human history. Interestingly, they talk about the same thing. They say the opposite of goodness or kindness is not evil necessarily, right? The opposite of a good person is not necessarily a bad person. They all say the opposite of goodness is in fact numbness. The moment we become numb to each other's pains, to each other's sorrows, to each other's stories, I find that very dangerous. Because when we become numb, anything can happen afterwards. All kinds of racism, all kinds of sexism, discrimination can be planted on that fertile soil once people become numb. And I'm worried that the world we're living in makes us numb to each other's pain. And we can't help it to a certain extent because we're bombarded with information and we're also bombarded with misinformation. And after a while, we just don't register it anymore. You know, what does it mean? 500,000 refugees, 5 million refugees, numbers we can't register it, take it in anymore. And every day we hear new things, we pay 5 seconds attention and then we move on, but we can't focus. So I make a distinction between information and knowledge and wisdom. I think these three are very different things. Information, ironically, paradoxically, can actually diminish. Too much information can diminish our knowledge. You know, having too much information about a certain subject might make us think that we know the subject, but knowledge is something else. Knowledge requires depth, focus. And as for wisdom, I think that needs emotional intelligence in addition to knowledge. And it makes me sad to see, particularly in academia, particularly in my field, political science, emotions are always underestimated. You know, they're not analyzed because they're not measurable data. We are just obsessed with measurable data, and yet the age we're living in is the age of emotions. It's an age in which emotions guide politics, misguide politics. It's the age of anxiety, anger, resentment, fear. There's no way we can understand today's political landscape and the turmoil we're going through, East and West, unless we understand the importance of emotions. And sadly, very sadly, perhaps populist demagogues are much better in terms of connecting with people's emotions than many others. And that's part of their appeal. So I can carry on, but I would love to stop here because I would love to continue together. Thank you.
Sorry, this is not a question maybe, but I want to hear more about, like, because in the opening, the open is about the decolonial discourse and also coming from the Turkey background. I want to hear more maybe from three of you, how do you relate in telling the personal story and the decolonial situation or discourse agenda? Yeah, thank you.
Would you like to begin?
No, you go ahead, please.
I'll start here. This is a question that would take me days to answer, to tell you everything that I think on this subject. I kind of want to begin with your notion of numbness and how important that is to me. I think for me, when I've been reading writers like Walter Mignolo on decolonial praxis and how to practice and how to use decolonial thinking to rethink how you work, there's some key things that come across, and one of them is about emotional labour and how that's not equally shared amongst people in any given space, in any given encounter. And coupled with that is the idea that if you are working in an academic field, it's very easy to seal yourself off from emotions. It's a very safe place, the ivory tower, very safe. You can discuss all kinds of very difficult topics in a very, very safe intellectual way. And it's when you reconnect with the emotions and when you reconnect with the actual realities of what you're speaking about, you start to address this issue of numbness that Elif has brought up, and you begin to even out the emotional imbalances that are produced by power imbalances in society. That's my immediate response. I could go on, but I'm going to...
No, please,
Well, I would second what Sarah says, and I think one of the things that we've been thinking about is this idea, often there's an idea in decoloniality that you want to redress a balance, or that you want to tell the histories and bring forward histories and moments and experiences to give equal representation on the sort of balance sheet of a bigger type of top-down history. But I don't think you can do that without first humanizing, again, to Elif's point, the stories of the people that you're trying to represent. And that the process of humanizing for me is, as you say, a deeply emotional one. I don't think that decolonial practice as an endeavor, whether within the academy or beyond the academy, can truly account for other human experience if we don't see people as people first. And it does mean that we have to move beyond numbers and taxonomies, and even actually beyond the way that big numbers determine ideas of nationhood and nation state and national identities as well. So I think they are very connected in that way.
Definitely. Yeah, I think I totally agree. Just to follow up, emotional intelligence, as I try to mention, it's a mixture of emotions and rational analysis. So you're not only guided by emotions, but you're aware of the importance of emotions. And as human beings, men or women, we are emotional creatures. You know, I think we shouldn't be shy about admitting that and saying that we connect through emotions. And interestingly, we remember through emotions. You know, just go back in your memory. The things that you remember more vividly, they're all tied to emotions. Sometimes bad emotions, sometimes very good emotions, but emotions are always there. This is how we relate to each other's story. But of course, coming back to the question of who is telling this story, you know, do I hear the other voices? In every nation state, there's an official historiography that is the same wherever you go in the world. But what makes a democracy different than a non-democracy is very clear to me. In a democracy, you can walk into a bookstore and you can easily find books that question, criticize, or offer an alternative view to the official narrative. In a non-democracy, you can't go to the bookstore and find those books easily because their writers are either, you know, arrested or in trouble. So what a non-democracy does is to try to suppress that plurality of voices. But pluralism is important, to understand that there are different ways of telling history. It depends on who is telling it. That is incredibly important, and that's why I believe stories can play an important role. And it makes me very sad when I hear And forgive me for being, I don't want to sound gender biased, but I've usually heard this from male readers. Sometimes they come and they say, I don't usually read novels. I read serious stuff. I read philosophy, history. And that distinction we make between non-fiction and fiction makes me sad, because I think we should read, our reading list should be quite eclectic. How can we forget the emotions? That's what stories do. They connect us with other people who are beyond our own limited personal experience. And that opens up not only our minds, but also our hearts. Just to give you one example, in Turkey, I have many readers who are quite xenophobic. If you ask their opinion about minorities in particular, about Armenians, Jews, Kurds, Alevis, because these are the main minorities in Turkey, they will tell you all kinds of negative things, because this is how they have been raised. But then they come and they say, I read your book, and this is the character that I love the most. And maybe mostly the fictional character they're referring to is a minority member, it's maybe Armenian or Jewish or Kurd. Equally, I have many homophobic readers, because we are a very sexist, very patriarchal society, and this is how we raise our children. But despite that, people come and they say, I read your book, and this is the character that I love the most, and why did you make that character cry, or something very emotional reaction. And again, maybe the character they're referring to is either gay or transsexual or bisexual. And I thought about this dilemma a lot. How is it possible that people who are less tolerant in the public space, when they are in the company of other people, right, when they take a novel, go to that inner space, because when we're reading a novel, we are very much alone. It's the loneliest form of art. We go into that inner garden, we're alone, we're not affected by our friends, by a collectivistic identity, we're on our own. And in that inner space, in that lonely space, we connect. It is not a coincidence that all forms of authoritarianism need collectivistic, synchronized energy. Right? Fascism needs multitudes. All kinds of totalitarian ideologies need multitudes. What they do is to try to erase individuality. Art restores individuality, but not a selfish individuality, not a self-centered one, but the kind of individuality that hopefully connects us with the rest of humanity. So for me as a novelist, it's very important to keep that inner garden, to keep that solitude as rich as we can with stories and with empathy.
I wonder if you could just expand what political science covers as opposed to just politics.
Mm-hmm. What political science covers? Political science is taught very differently in Europe, as for instance, in continental Europe mostly, as opposed to the mainstream trend in America, where it's more empirical, data-based, quantitative. You have to measure, and I have a lot of respect for that work. So please don't get me wrong, but I am much more interested in the philosophy of politics. So the questions we ask ourselves about what it means, what does freedom mean? What does liberty mean? What does democracy mean? And I think these are questions that we're asking ourselves again in the times we're living in. So it is that kind of political science, which is closer to political philosophy, that I've always been interested in. The other side, which can sometimes be completely data-driven, I don't find it enough. And I think if we're solely focused on data, we can miss out a lot in life. And it's not a coincidence that many experts actually failed to see lots of things coming, from the financial crisis to the Arab Spring, from Brexit to the election of Trump. People who knew a lot failed to see these things coming. If we only live in our own echo chambers, if we only narrow down our analysis between walls, we might know a lot about a particular subject, but we're missing out the connections. I think we need to be aware of those connections. So to me, it's a big problem that we're living in information bubbles, ghettos, And it's a growing problem also because more and more people get their resources from particular places and don't even read what the other says. In universities, I know this is a very heated subject, you might disagree with me, but I'm equally critical of safe spaces when it's carried to an extreme, when anyone who has a different opinion is vetoed or cannot find a platform to speak. I'm also very cautious about that. I do believe in freedom of speech. Of course, I draw a line. The kind of hate speech that incites violence is something else. But other than that, I think we should be able to hear different voices, engage in conversations with people who do not necessarily think like us, live like us, vote like us. To me, it's very essential, and I believe it's going to be one of the biggest challenges, particularly for progressive-minded people. How do we communicate beyond these echo chambers? Because if we can't do that, I am worried that we're going to become more and more polarized. And I come from a country that has been bitterly polarized, and the only people who have benefited from that were the demagogues. So it is not healthy for a society to be angrily, bitterly polarized and pulled in completely antagonistic tribes. We have to be able to nurture, coexistence, shared values. How do we do that? And for that, I think we need stories, we need connections, and perhaps we need a new narrative.
Thank you very much. Really enjoying listening to these. Talking about emotional numbness and perhaps about the bombardment of information that we all have and how much we can't connect with things emotionally, or like talking about emotional connection. Do you have any kind of suggestions in ways in which on our daily lives, day to day, that we can implement that within our work? And I'm talking like from a Western perspective, because obviously there are many places which that we've maybe visited that don't have that kind of incessant advertising, social media, and things. So from this perspective, for us who are in the room now, are there ways in which we can, as artists, as practitioners, start to change that?
Yeah, thank you so much. Two things I would love to share with you. I'm very worried about the dark side of social media, and I think for a very long time we have spoken about the bright side of social media for so long. We have over-romanticized it, especially my generation, right? There was this extreme tech optimism, how technology was going to connect us, we were all going to become one big global village, national borders or nationalisms, ultra-nationalisms were going to disappear, thanks to the thanks to ideas, people, capital, traveling, more and more people will become so interdependent that there wouldn't be any more wars, violence, etc. All those predictions in late 1990s, early 2000s, that was a time of extreme optimism. And I think today we need to talk about the dark side of social media. One thing that it does is it divides us. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It was supposed to connect us beyond borders. What it's doing, in fact, is pushing us into tribes. This was the last election in America, was the first election in America in which the majority of the population got their information, political information, not from newspapers, but from social media. 67% of Americans got their political information from social media, mostly from Facebook. So imagine the impact, how it affects us. But it's not a neutral arena anymore, particularly after 2012, 2013, after Facebook, Google, they restructured themselves, each and every one of us, our personal relations, what we're doing, our friendships, everything has become data that is collected and used, mostly for profit reasons, but increasingly so for political reasons as well. We have to keep an eye on social media. There is no way we can afford being indifferent or numb. I think we have to become active citizens. I passionately believe in this. Citizens, not when I say this, I'm not talking about partisan politics. I don't even like party politics. But the kind of active citizens who care about shared values like democracy, like liberal democracy, freedom of speech, women's rights, LGBT rights, each and every one of these things can be taken away from us. We can't take it for granted. And we also need to become active citizens in the digital world, just to keep an eye. If there's a misinformation, even not to retweet it, right, is an active thing. You're actively participating and saying, no, this is misinformation, I'm not going to expand it. But for that, we need to be alert. We need to be aware of the dangers of extreme tribalism and what kind of hatred and antagonism that can cause. If I may share this with you, in one of my novels, my latest novel, 3 Daughters of Eve, I talk about 3 young women who are attending Oxford University. They all come from Muslim backgrounds, but their connection with religion is completely different. So there's Shirin, who is British Iranian, and she's the child of exiled parents who had to run away from fundamentalism, and she's an atheist. And she's very critical of all religions, but in particular of Islam, because of the lack of gender equality. Then there's Mona, who wears a headscarf, who is Egyptian American. She's a practicing Muslim, and she complains about Islamophobia because this is something she experiences regularly. Then there's a Turkish girl whose name is Piri, and she has lots of questions about everything and anything. And jokingly, they call themselves the sinner, the believer, and the confused. And the story mostly focuses on the journey of the confused. The reason why I'm sharing this with you, because throughout that novel, I tried to ask myself and the readers this question. Look at these 3 girls, they're very different. Can they be friends? Can they be sisters? Can they find a common language? What do they share? And I think this is a practice, mental practice, that we need to do a lot in our daily lives. We might be very different in our outlooks, personal opinions, but does that mean that we don't have anything in common? And the region where I come from, the Middle East, women such as Mona, Shirin, and Piri, the sinner, the believer, and the confused, they don't talk to each other. And when we women are so badly divided, the only thing that benefits from that is patriarchy itself. Can't we nonetheless have an all-embracing women's movement, that because we're all in it together, we're all affected by a system that discriminates against women. This is just an example, but I find it very important to try to go beyond our own personal islands or cultural ghettos.
Hi, I'm Gülce. I'm Turkish as well.
Oh, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I consider my work as political as well, but because I'm angry and it's hard to separate myself from the anger of the current situation.
Yeah.
But then there's this, especially now that we are writing when it's a political piece of writing or critical, there's always this danger within me that I have to keep my voice, but then if this work is ever published, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a very common thing now, but I wondered how you managed between this keeping your own voice and this macro danger in front.
Yeah.
And also I wanted to ask about, I mean, it's obvious we can continue to publish from a foreign country, but then I also question the trap of not producing genuine work which doesn't reflect those people's stories enough anymore by being an outsider.
I thank you so much. Both questions resonate with me deeply, and I know how you feel, how the anger, the frustration, when everything is going backwards, we tend to think that history has to go forwards. We tend to think that tomorrow is going to be more progressive than yesterday, but not necessarily. And countries like Turkey have shown us that actually things can go backwards very fast. And that is the collapse of not only politics, but in a way the fabric of the society. If I may add this, I think the Turkish case also shows us that we have to make a distinction between democracy and majoritarianism. You might have the ballot box elections. We have it in Turkey, right? That doesn't make it a democracy. If you don't have rule of law, separation of powers, definitely a free media, diverse media, independent academia. If academicians get arrested because they have signed a peace petition, how can there be freedom there? If there's no separation of powers, if all power is concentrated in the hands of one person, how can that be a democracy? Under these circumstances, how can we write? But all I want to tell you is these are questions that have been asked by so many people before us, people who lived in authoritarian regimes, and are being asked today by so many other people, not only coming from Turkey, but imagine from now Brazil, Venezuela, more and more Hungary, Poland, Philippines, Russia. Sadly, the list is so long, and it's getting longer and longer. In 2017, the Freedom House published a report, and it was quite heartbreaking because 35 countries had made progress. You might think it's good news, but twice as many, 71 countries, had gone backwards very fast. And of course, one of those 71 countries is our motherland. But the question I think we ask ourselves is, how do we keep our voice? How do we not lose our voice? But also, I try to ask myself, I don't want to write out of anger. I mean, anger is an important feeling, but the problem with anger is after a while it becomes like a snake that it eats its own tail. It becomes enclosed, and people who speak out of anger start to repeat themselves. Anger just pulls you down. So if we can channelize anger into something more positive, more constructive, I think that's good. If we remain trapped in our own anger, I don't think that is good, and I don't think that will help us at all. Please forgive me, the second part of your question.
It was about producing work
from outside, and how can we keep the authenticity? Yeah. I mentioned very briefly my approach to identity politics. I'm very critical of identity politics, and maybe always have been. Instead of identity politics, I like multiple belongings. So I think each and every one of us, we are composed of different cells, but we tend to suppress many cells and present only one of those in the public space. But to me, it's much closer to my heart to understand that I have multiple belongings. Yes, I am an Istanbulite. Yes, I am attached to the Balkans, Aegean, Mediterranean. There are so many elements in my soul that I bring from the Middle East. I will always have them with me. But I am a European by birth, by choice, the values that I share. Over the years, I have become a Londoner. And despite what the Prime Minister says, I think it is valuable to become a world citizen. A global soul. So why can't we be multiple things? If we see it this way, then I think that takes a big pressure off your shoulders. Otherwise, if we see it as, okay, there's Turkey there, or there's motherland there, and I'm here, inside, outside, then we start to see it in more monolithic terms. And that creates the illusion that we're not part of it anymore. But of course you're part of it. At the same time, you're part of many other things. And I think being an insider-outsider is actually maybe the best position for an artist, because that means emotionally you're insider enough to understand, to connect with the people, to love, but at the same time enough of an outsider to have the cognitive distance to see things from a different angle. And that's good. That's not bad. That's not, something that takes away from you. I think it's a source of richness. So what I learned over the years was, instead of asking myself, well, I'm not in Turkey the whole time, and I get this criticism in Turkey a lot, also because I write in English, People say, how can she be called a Turkish writer anymore? You know, she doesn't even write in. I don't think in those 19th century nationalistic terms. I think that's not the world I'm living in. This is the world of movements, migrations. It's a world in which more and more of us dream in more than one language. Sometimes we express our anger in a different language. I know many Turkish ladies who cannot swear in Turkish because they have been brought up in a very prim and proper way, but I hear them swear in English all the time. You know, that they feel light when they do that. So it's quite interesting how we change as we move from one language to another. And that's not weakness, that's richness. So I'm sure with your perspective, you're going to add so much to the narrative because you know both worlds so well.
Thank you. There's one right there. We're going to have to wrap up this section now, but thank you so much. Elif, you have managed to prefigure so many of the things that we are going to go on to do in the rest of this quite short evening, about telling our stories, about connecting multiple belongings and multiple selves. Elif's books and Elif will be out in the cafe now, so first of all, can we join me in thanking Elif so much? So we've set out in the Dyson Cafe 20 provocations and plenty of alcohol. We're hoping that while you're having a drink, you'll help us to write a collaborative essay, and we're calling this an essay sprint because the idea is that everyone effortlessly contributes something and then it will be put together in a kind of 30-minute frenzy and become an amazing collaborative piece that a place for many voices and many new ideas. What you'll find is there are provocations around the Dyson Cafe area which we'd like you to respond to. So there's paper and pens out there, but you can respond in any way you want. So if you want to tear up a piece of paper, do that, or draw a picture, or however you'd like to interact. We're going to take your contributions and create this experimental collaborative essay, which will then be shared in a forthcoming exhibition and also the exhibition catalogue. And I was very interested in the way that Elif was talking about synchronised collective selves, and I think that the essay sprint is yet another way in which we'll be able to do that. During the essay sprint, which is basically going on between now and when we get kicked out of the cafe, I'm going to be announcing a 30-minute emotional parkour session, which will be in here. So when you go out, I'm going to set this space up, and then I will come out and announce it. Now, I'm afraid we've only got space for 25 people to take part in that, so I will just take the first 25 people that come in. The emotional parkour session is a set of games that explore emotional terrains, perhaps deep an understanding of our positions and our cultural grounds. And what I'll invite you to do is come in, play the games, and then as you leave, I'll give you a further explanation. But it's not none of what we're doing here is supposed to be hard work, but all of it is very serious, put it that way. Okay, so I invite you to take a serious drink to begin with. Thank you.